You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name's Ryan Evans. I'm the founder of War on the Rocks. In this episode, I sat down with Congressman Jim Himes. He is the ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He's a Democrat from Connecticut. We had a wide-ranging conversation, beginning with what's happening in the Caribbean around Venezuela and the strikes on alleged drug boats, zooming out from there to broader issues related to Latin America, and then going on from China to Europe to the Middle East. We really covered a lot. It was a fascinating conversation. I think you will enjoy it. Congressman, thanks for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
We live in a pretty nutty world right now. I think you share many of the concerns that I do about what's happening in and around Venezuela. Let's start with these strikes on what we're told are drug trafficking boats. What's your view of the fact that they're happening at all and how the administration is or is not working with Congress on what's happening?
Yeah, the answer there is not working with Congress. And look, there's at least three things that are wrong about these strikes on these boats. And it's a hard argument to make because in this very polarized, very angry environment, I'll make these 3 points and people say, but yeah, we should kill more drug dealers. It's just there's some Arnold Schwarzenegger Hollywood-esque appeal to blowing up these boats and stuff. But look, here's the problems. Number one, they're illegal, right? They are not authorized by anybody. In this country, it's always been clear, even if there's been tension between the president and the Congress, that if you're going to go attack somebody, especially if you haven't been militarily attacked, that is to say, on 9/11, for example, we were attacked, Pearl Harbor, we were attacked. You come to Congress and get authorization for the use of military force. And it doesn't matter if you call a group terrorist group. That doesn't give you lethal authority.
Well, let's unpack, let's zoom into that a little bit. So that seems to be the administration's argument is they've given the FTO designation, which is Congress gives the State Department that authority to grant an organization a foreign terrorist organization. That comes with some powers, especially when it comes to financial tools and investigative tools. But it does not come with war powers tools and authority to conduct lethal strikes.
Correct. There's all sorts of designated terrorist organizations against whom lethal force is not authorized. And you're exactly right. Designating somebody. Now, by the way, we'd have a whole other conversation whether it makes sense to designate a cartel as a terrorist organization. If you're going to expand the definition that way, why not call the mafia a terrorist organization? Why not call, the Bloods and the Crips in South Central Los Angeles terrorist organizations? I actually think it's probably worth keeping categories separate here. But as you point out, designating somebody as a foreign terrorist organization has a lot of financial implications. If they're designated, you can't give them money. But there's absolutely no authority associated with that to go and kill people. Which brings us to the second thing, which is, even if there were authority, and I'm not sure they'd get authority, this is not where the drugs are flowing, right? Look, we have a serious problem in this country. Some 80, 90,000 Americans die of overdoses, mostly fentanyl. Fentanyl is not coming from Venezuela. Yes, cocaine trickles out of Colombia. And yes, there's some bad people, gangs and paramilitaries on the Venezuelan side that are involved with drug trafficking. But the fentanyl is coming up through Mexico using Chinese precursors. We have great fidelity on the intelligence side as to where this is flowing. So we're illegally killing civilians for no practical benefit other than the testosterone-like rush that you get when you see a boat blow up.
And what I've read is if these even indeed are drug boats, that they are serving markets that are not even American markets, supposedly. Some of them are maybe going to Europe eventually. Which then raises the question as to what extent is this actually about drugs? Because if it was saying, if you're the administration, you're saying we're going to treat drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and we want to strike them, as you were indicating earlier. The problem's in Mexico. So why are we striking Venezuela and not conducting strikes on Mexico? I'm not arguing for it, but
right.
It does speak to the larger question is, what is this actually about? Is it about drugs or is it about the regime in charge of Venezuela?
Look, I think this is an area where you can overthink the Trump administration. So much of the Trump administration is performative, just stuff that looks good. And I say that because there's this whole theory out there that this is all a way of trying to destabilize Maduro's regime. And maybe even with a carrier strike group, the USS Ford moving into position, maybe even a military attack on Venezuela. This is just one opinion, but it's more informed probably than the average. I don't think that's going to happen. Now, I do think that Donald Trump, and especially his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who comes out of that sort of Miami Cuban tradition, I think they would love to see the Maduro regime fall. And maybe in the back of their minds, they sort of feel like putting a lot of military assets north of the country destabilizes them. But I am 99% sure that there will not be a military attack on Venezuela by the United States.
Well, it's sort of like Iran. We would all love to see the regime go away, but it's how you do it, which is a lesson that, We're both old enough, especially you, no offense, to remember what happened with Iraq. And it matters how you actually get these things done.
Well, I'm really old enough to remember, and Marco Rubio knows this. Marco Rubio obviously understands Latin America. Iran is an interesting thing. Iran has this just genetic anxiety and suspicion of foreigners because in 1954, the United States, with the Great Britain's help, helped overthrow a democratically elected government there. That is the story of Latin America in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And Rubio understands that political change made in Latin America at the point of a Marine's gun is a very, very bad idea. It leads to all sorts of instability and stuff. So another reason why I don't think that's likely to happen.
I don't know if I agree with you. I mean, this is all leading up to something. You might be right. This could just be a case of coercive diplomacy. I've read in the paper. I don't get any classified intelligence briefings. I'm not going to ask you to disclose anything that's sensitive. But from what I've read in the paper, there's been negotiations going on with the Maduro regime about trying to get him to step down. And apparently whatever Caracas has offered is not enough. And you could argue maybe they're just ramping up pressure to get a better deal for his exit. Or you could argue they're actually going to attack. It seems to me you wouldn't put a carrier strike group. You wouldn't, according to media reports, at least send JSOC down there and all this stuff unless you were going to do something.
Look, I may eat my words. Trump is unpredictable, but I just see nothing other than the performative aspect of this that suggests that there's an appetite for a ground war. I mean, can you imagine, look, the United States military would dispatch the Venezuelan military pretty quickly in a war, but we would have fatalities, right? Could you imagine this guy who came to power saying, what we're going to do is put America first, saying, okay, now we just lost 10 Marines in Maracaibo? I don't see that happening. And sure, Trump and Rubio and others would love to see the regime fall, but they don't have any leverage. You said they've been negotiating. Negotiating what, right? We have no commercial interplay, no commercial trade with Venezuela. I don't know what cards we have to negotiate. And oh, by the way, I mean, I would hope that Rubio and others would understand that if we initiated an attack and the Maduro regime falls and we now have chaos in Venezuela, you know what looks worse than a Venezuela governed by Maduro? It's a Venezuela in chaos, destabilizing Colombia, opening up ungoverned spaces. That's a terrible outcome.
Let's go back to the role of Congress in all this. When something like this is happening, when there's a crisis, what is the administration supposed to be doing with your committee, with the Select Intelligence Committee?
Well, under the law, I understand how quaint that sounds these days, but under the law, the administration could undertake these attacks by coming to Congress and making the case and saying, look, we're going to put our military assets at risk here and we're going to do some very aggressive actions. So we want authorization. It's kind of the way you and I are old enough to remember when Barack Obama told the Congress that Bashar al-Assad in Syria has crossed my red line. I'm going to ask you for permission to do what he at the time called pinprick strikes, missile strikes against Syria. It was pretty clear that wasn't getting through the Congress, which is interesting enough in and of itself. But anyway, that would be the thing to do. In the absence of that, you have this secret Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, opinion, which has not been shared with anybody in the Congress. And
not even your committee.
Not even my committee.
You haven't seen the legal justification.
I have been promised that I will see this famous OLC memo, and I'm really interested in seeing it because if you think about it, it's secret, okay? If you're in the chain of command, you're the master chief or the lieutenant commander on the boat in the Caribbean, you might have questions about the legality of I hope you have questions, right? I mean, for 250 years, the United States military has done everything it can to avoid targeting civilians. Now we're deliberately targeting civilians. Yeah, we could argue that.
There's a few Dresden, Tokyo fire bombings, but
Yeah. Okay. That's
but I'd say certainly in the more recent decades.
But anyway, okay. Fair point. But, anyway, so if you're that lieutenant commander, that master chief, and somebody says, oh, well, there's an OLC opinion that will protect you, then you probably feel comfortable doing what you're being ordered to do.
Yeah. And what is supposed to be happening? What's the Gang of Eight's role in all this? Explain it to people that might not be familiar with how this works.
Well, so the Gang of Eight is a subset of the intelligence leaders in the Congress, and it doesn't have any particular authorities. The reason it exists is the reason that the intelligence committees exist, but more so. The intelligence committees exist, of course, because particularly coming out of the abuses of the 60s and the 70s when, CIA was running rampant and Richard Nixon was thinking about whether he could pull the CIA into his political interests. By the way, that's an interesting echo today. So the committees were formed and a law was passed that said any meaningful intelligence activity needs to be reported to these committees, and it's done in secret behind closed closed doors. The Gang of Eight is the next level up. It's stuff that is particularly sensitive, that if it escaped, if the information escaped, because let's face it, there are leaks, and the probability of a leak is proportional to the number of people who know the secret. The Gang of Eight is just designed to be a very small room where very sensitive stuff can be discussed. That's it. It doesn't have any particular authorities.
So would you argue the administration is in violation of its legal obligations to share information with the Intelligence Committee, but with the Gang of Eight, it's more of a practice or a norm?
Oh, no question. No question. I mean, let me speak. We've been talking about the military. Let me speak to my area of jurisdiction, which is intelligence. I don't know exactly who or how, but obviously the intelligence community is providing a lot of information for these lethal strikes. And lo and behold, I have not even been told who's doing that or how they're doing that. And that really matters because, and here I'll be a little careful about how detailed I get, but, famously, and we can talk about it because Barack Obama talked about the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, right? That was done covertly. And the reason he talked about it was because Anwar al-Awlaki was a U.S. citizen. You may remember all of that conversation. Yeah. When we do those sorts of things, there's an immense amount of protocol and care. And here you would be right to point out that it's gotten better over time to avoid the killing of innocents, to make sure that you've got the right guy. Really complicated protocols requiring all kinds of people to sign off for a counterterrorist strikes. I have no reason to believe that any of those protocols are being followed now. I don't really believe we may know if there's 11 guys on a boat, as there was in that first strike. It wouldn't surprise me if we knew who maybe 2 or 3 of them were. We're pretty good at picking up people's cell phone signals, that sort of thing. But I'd be shocked if we knew everybody who's getting incinerated by these raids. And that's a little weird, right? We're killing people, civilians. We don't even, as far as I know precisely who they are.
What concerns me also about this is, I worked in southern Afghanistan as a Department of Defense civilian years ago at the height of the surge, and was very involved in looking at a lot of the counter-narcotic stuff. That's where, at the time, 80% of the world's illegal opium came from that one province, Helmand. And a lot of the people involved in doing it were just poor farmers and people that took things from point A to point B who were just trying to make ends meet. These were not people that were getting rich on this. Now, I don't know who was on those boats, what their socioeconomic status was, but I can't help but wonder, are these just some poor saps that were told, hey, here's $50, go drive a boat?
I do. I've been around Panama and Colombia and elsewhere. I can't tell you precisely who was on the boats that we incinerated, but you're making precisely the right point. This is not the kingpins. Kingpins are not getting behind the wheels of a 34-foot fast boat. These are guys who are getting paid $100 to run something to Trinidad. And so, you're killing guys who have no economic opportunity, who are just taking that $100. And you can say, well, they're complicit in this. Okay, that's right. But this leads to the thing that we haven't talked about. If you can put a Hellfire missile into a 34-foot fast boat, you can do what we've traditionally done, which is interdict it. Now you get the drugs, which is the point here, I guess. And you get to interview a whole bunch of people who can tell you who their bosses are, where they were going,
the Coast Guard
what the operations
normally does,
are. And, we've been doing that forever. And when you do that, you get intelligence, which is really helpful. And by the way, you don't piss off Colombia and those surrounding countries who are a little suspicious for historical reasons of our quote-unquote kinetic activity. So, again, not only is this illegal, and look, I get it. It's like watching a Schwarzenegger movie when you see one of these boats blow up. You're like, oh, isn't that awesome? But look, it's illegal, and we are a country of laws, and it's not even particularly effective if what we're trying to do is to reduce the amount of drugs coming into our country.
I think we should be most concerned about the constitutional and domestic legal implications, which we've been discussing. There's also international legal implications, which are also important. Typically, what we would see exercised in international law would be international legal enforcement, which you just mentioned, Coast Guard stopping a boat, detaining them, and then arresting them if they were trafficking drugs, gathering intelligence. The Coast Guard's part of the Department of Homeland Security now. But now what we're seeing is the activation of wartime authorities. So treating this as a wartime situation in international law, which there doesn't seem to be an international legal justification for. Do you think this is a broader trend, not just in this administration, but one that perhaps started in the Bush administration? Or do you think this is more of a invention of the current administration, this way of approaching it?
So to me, the dramatic difference between the traditional counterterrorism activities, where we've conducted lethal activities around the world to take out terrorists, and what we're doing right now and this is why I say the distinction between a terrorist group and a drug cartel is worth maintaining, is that, George W. Bush, right up to the present day, after 9/11, we had a campaign, the Global War on Terror. Sounds like maybe you were part of that in Afghanistan. And then we were up against guys who statedly wanted to end the United States and were quite happy to undertake the military attacks that they could undertake. They didn't have tanks, they didn't have F-16s, but they commandeered airliners, they made bombs. That's a military threat. Now, it needs to be dealt with in different ways than fighting the Russian army, on the plains of Germany. But that's a military threat by being leveled by people who are determined to end your country. That's not what drug cartels do. Drug cartels has a demand component to it, right? There's a reason why they're risking their lives to bring drugs to the United States, because a lot of Americans want to pay a lot of money to buy their product. So it's just a radically different scenario. And what really scares me, again, we've apparently abandoned the rule of law in this country. At least the administration has abandoned the rule of law. But no one's even asking, even the guys who are like, oh, look at that, we blew up a boat, isn't that awesome? It's like Schwarzenegger. They're not asking what the limiting principle is here. Okay, it's like, how far of a step is it from that to allowing the police to execute drug lords on the streets of Brooklyn, right? That's not legal, but that's consistent with this idea that we're at war with somebody. When are we going to start rounding up Americans who use fentanyl because they are complicit and supporting these so-called terrorists? So, what's the limiting principle here? That has not been described to us.
Well, I've seen some argue, and I see some of the merits in this argument, that this is all the result of a slippery slope that began with the war on terror and the erosion of civil liberties. And all these foreign wars historically always have domestic legal and social and ethical implications. And it could be, I've also seen others similarly argue that this is a result of a slippery slope started by the Obama administration's willingness to use drones, including against people like al-Awlaki, even though he was apparently involved in operational terrorist planning against the United States. I'm not sad to see him go. But this argument's been made that this is just the logical outcome of a process that started earlier this century. What do you make of that?
I'm not sure I buy that. And the reason for that is there's one stark difference. The Obama administration, which was pretty aggressive on counterterrorism, witness the al-Awlaki thing, was obsessed with staying inside the law. Now, you may disagree that the al-Awlaki strike where they killed a U.S. citizen was legal, but it is absolutely true that they twisted themselves up into knots. They had the Office of Legal Counsel write a report. They shared that with the relevant congressional committees. It was clearly authorized by an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force. None of that is true today. They have not shared the secret legal opinion on why this is legal with anybody in the Congress. There is no authorization for the use of military force. So I guess to me, it feels more like a step change. Yes, we've been acting kinetically abroad against terrorists. To me, it's a pretty massive step change that we're now using the U.S. military to take out a bunch of mooks on a power boat. That's just big. And the difference, of course, is, do you care about the law? Obama, you may have disagreed with where he landed or where his people landed, but he spent a lot of time thinking about the law. I don't think the Trump administration gives a damn.
Before we move on to the next, I just want to quickly plug my friend Alexander Melagro Hitchens' excellent book on Anwar al-Awlaki that was published several years ago, but it holds up really great. Next issue, I want to zoom out and talk about how this fits into the Trump administration's broader Latin American policy. You see now eroding ties and political confrontation with Colombia. We've seen this currency swap of tens of billions of dollars with Argentina. What's your view of the direction of policy towards Latin America, where this is heading and where you'd like to see it heading instead?
Well, we're doing exactly to Latin America what we told Latin America for 2 generations that they shouldn't do, which is sort of to corruptly try to influence politics, for example. When, Donald Trump decided that he was going to put tariffs on Brazil because they didn't like that Brazil was prosecuting his friend, President Bolsonaro, who, by the way, tried to lead a coup against the Brazilian state when he gives, Argentina, I used to work in Latin American banking. Argentina is like the epitome of the financial basket case. Why is a bailout going to Argentina from an America First president? Because he likes the dude, right? He likes the sort of, disruptive aspect of Milei. Why is he attacking Colombia? Because he doesn't like the fact that Petro is a leftist. So a lot of Latin America, like a lot of the way Donald Trump thinks about the world, will be driven by what he personally thinks, moderated, but to some extent by the awareness of the White House that, we should be nice to people that have rare earth minerals. And of course, there's a fair amount of that down in Latin America. So this will be
including in Argentina.
Including Argentina, yeah, primarily Bolivia and Chile and other places. But yes.
Hi, my name is Carrie Anderson, membership editor at War on the Rocks. Speaking of Argentina, we are taking a quick break from this conversation with Congressman Himes to feature a short trailer from a recent episode of The Insider, one of our many members-only podcasts. This conversation features Benjamin Gadan, who wrote, "When Ideology Writes the Check, Washington's Risky Bet on Argentina for War on the Rocks." In your article, you argued that Trump could have made a foreign policy case for supporting Argentina that would have won bipartisan support. Instead, he's actually faced some bipartisan criticism. But how would you make that case for bipartisan support?
The foreign policy argument, which I think is more compelling, is that Argentina is the second biggest economy in South America. It's a member of the G20. It has expressed a desire to align very closely with the United States, including on great power competition issues, which is to say on U.S.-China competition. And that's exceedingly rare in the Americas. And so you might say that Argentina is an important battleground for U.S.-China competition. There's also arguments in terms of the value of having support when the U.S. appears to be pivoting to the Western Hemisphere, right? There's reports that the new national security strategy and defense strategy will prioritize the Western Hemisphere. It's going to be difficult to actualize that strategy without allies in the region. And the U.S. has very few partners at the moment. The governments in all the big economies, such as Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, keep the United States at arm's length or have outwardly hostile relations with the United States. So that makes Argentina a unique foreign policy opportunity at the moment.
How does President Milei view China?
Javier Milei said that there was just a values alignment between Argentina and the United States, and that should lead Argentina to prioritize relations with the United States, even at the expense of China. Now, I should note, like many conservative candidates in the Americas and elsewhere who expressed skepticism about China during a campaign, governing has proved a different reality. And in fact, Milei has said some flattering things about doing business with China since he's been in office. China is the biggest market for Argentina's commodity exports. It's a major trading partner. It would devastatingly damage the Argentine economy if it lost access to the Chinese market. So I don't want to exaggerate the pivot that we've seen in Argentina, but it is significant that he would even say these things.
You can listen to this episode and access all of our membership offerings by going to wartherocks.com/membership. And now, back to the show.
And so again, it's the same old story. Policy will be driven. The president gets his nose out of joint because the province of Ontario runs an ad with Ronald Reagan's quotes about tariffs, and he slaps tariffs on Canada. This is a very personalist, you pissed me off, me personally, kind of foreign policy. Again, moderated, to be fair, by, I think, the overall awareness that there's a lot of stuff that we need from places like Canada, places like Bolivia, right? Rare earth minerals, commodities, energy, et cetera.
Do you think there's any motivation in terms of trying to entrench Latin America against China? Any logic to that foreign policy in the current administration?
Well, if so, man, what a way to do this, right? Out of nowhere, Trump sanctions the Colombian president, right? What do you think? And the Colombian president reacted exactly the way you'd expect him to react. He's like, okay, we have to start talking to China here. If we show the big middle finger to any country, the Chinese will rush to fill that vacuum.
What would be your positive vision? Let's say you were Secretary of State right now and you were forging and advising, obviously, a different president on Latin America policy. What would be your positive vision for how our foreign policy down there should work?
Yeah, I think I would take it in almost the opposite direction that it has been taken. I think, in the Obama administration, a free trade deal was signed with Panama and with Colombia, giving these countries the opportunity to trade with us in a more frictionless way. I had the opportunity to tour the port of Cartagena, which is really, really interesting because it could be used and was used for a lot of drug transshipment. We helped them modernize it, and now it has added huge amounts of prosperity to Colombia because it's a good modern 21st century port. So I think I would say, number one, let's trade more. Let's figure out ways, and that's, of course, the opposite instinct, think, that Donald Trump has, because he regards trade as a win-lose situation. And then I would make a real effort, to your point about the Chinese, to say, okay, we're trading more now. Let's talk about what you give up when you install Huawei gear in La Paz, right? And have that partnership-like conversation where we persuade them to angle away from the Chinese, who are doing their thing, right?
Which is actually what Trump and Biden did Trump's first term in Europe with Chinese infrastructure, technical infrastructure, not so much on trade, but it's a very different approach. But Biden also did this work, unfortunately not linking free trade as much as I would like. Free trade seems to be out of fashion, but
totally. Yeah. No, and I mean, the EU is very different than Latin America, for historical reasons, namely that we would regularly, in the early, 100 years ago, regularly land the Marines on the shores of Honduras and the Dominican Republic, and you name it. They're very, very suspicious and very genetically resistant to being pushed around by the United States, right? There's a saying in Mexico, woe's Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States, right? So there's a real sensitivity there that doesn't necessarily exist in France and Germany, where the relationship is very different. Look, I think to look at Europe, because you brought it up, I think Europe's very conscious of the fact that the United States has provided an extraordinarily expensive security umbrella to the continent for a couple of generations. And it's time for a slightly fairer allocation of the costs of that security umbrella.
Moving up north a bit towards the southern border, we've had this ongoing military deployment to the southern border. I think we can politically agree or disagree with this, and I'm happy to hear your view on it. I'm hearing from soldiers that whatever we think about the politics of it, there's actually some really troubling and interesting activity going on, especially in terms of cartel usage of drones, or we assume they're cartels. We're actually not sure. And there's a lot of learning going on that might serve the Army for the future fight. What do you make of this issue more broadly?
I think I might separate those two issues. There's no doubt in my mind, look, that the Biden administration and the Democrats really got the border wrong. There's something viscerally appalling about the imagery of thousands of people spilling across your border. And so got that wrong, and as a political matter. And, I don't like the brutality by which the Trump administration has enforced immigration law. It's pretty appalling to see masked men pulling folks out of cars and stuff. But securing the border is the right thing to do. So, yeah. And look, I want to be very careful about that. You said you were making the point about the military. I'm not sure I want Marines deployed on the border. But, National Guard units that are cyber experts and can learn about the drones that you were talking about. Sure. Look, we haven't mentioned the single thing that there's two other things, of course, that account not just for, stuff on the border. When you do have a policy as brutal as the deportation policy that Trump has manifested, that's a disincentive for people to either come here or stay here. But the other thing, and this gets boring, but it's how you solve this problem, when you finally put in place an immigration system that brings in the right number of immigrants and that also allows people to come in legally to work on farms, to pick, all the various visa systems, when you do that, and then you say, we now have a 21st century visa and immigration program, and we are going to crack down hard on employers who break the law. Stanching that demand is how you really, in the long run, stop this.
Yeah, I don't see them holding the employers accountable, and I'm horrified by the behavior of ICE. On to bigger issues. We touched on critical minerals. As we're recording this, the president's in Asia. He's going to meet with Xi. We've apparently reached some sort of a framework for an agreement in which China will delay its critical minerals restrictions by a year and do something about fentanyl precursors, although that's from the White House statement. That wasn't in the Chinese statement. What are you hearing? What do you think is going to happen? What should happen? I think a lot of this trade war was totally unavoidable. It's sort of a problem of Washington's own making at this point, but where do you think we should go next?
Yeah, Trump has a hard time understanding that we've got a lot of leverage on the Chinese, largely in the form of advanced chips. They just don't make them. The cutting-edge chips, they don't make them. They've got a huge amount of leverage on us, and they're deploying it right now, right? They're saying, guess what? We're not going to send you our rare earth minerals. They're the source of something like 90% of rare earth minerals, and they're saying we're not buying your soybeans. So Donald Trump stumbles into these gunfights thinking that he's got all the leverage when he doesn't. And so as a consequence, we get into these lunatic things where, he pisses off the Chinese. The Chinese say, we're not buying your soybeans. Now Donald Trump's political political base, farmers, are really suffering. So now Donald Trump says, well, we're going to take $28 billion of the tariff revenue and give it to the farmers. I mean, that's just a bizarre way of operating. So he misunderstands that the Chinese have, and look, he gets it, right? I mean, on Liberation Day, would we have a 5 or 6 point market drop? And lo and behold, this is where the taco trade developed, right? When he saw how markets moved, when he was messing around with the Chinese relationship or generally global trading relationship, all of a sudden we had the taco trade, right? Oops, we didn't really mean that. And so, I think he's coming to learn that that lots of other countries have lots of other, maybe not Venezuela, but lots of other countries have lots of leverage that he's got to be mindful of. And what I hope this leads, look, I'm suspicious of the personalist brand of diplomacy, but one of the overarching themes here, and it's in this building, we're guilty of it more than anything else, is to think of the Chinese as the old Soviets, right? But that's the wrong way to think about it, right? For one thing, the Chinese do a lot of stuff that is appalling to our value system, but, they run a reasonable country with a hell of an economy, and we're going to have to trade with that economy. And so I think we should be doing, and hopefully Trump will do this, taking the temperature down with the relationship with the Chinese, right? We're spending immense amounts of time, money, and energy planning what a war with China would look like. And you know as better than I do that a war with China would look really, really ugly. So let's spend a little bit of time trying to have the conversations that make that war less likely.
Well, I certainly agree with you in principle, but do you still think we should be building up military capabilities and capacity focused on the Indo-Pacific, or do you think we should be being less aggressive on that as well?
No, I think it's the old Reagan mantra of peace through strength. Look, I have no illusions about the ambitions of the Chinese. So, yes, and I mean we can keep running political bumper stickers. Talk softly, carry a big stick. Teddy Roosevelt, right? I mean, no, we need the presence there to make it very clear that we've got profound interests in the region and that there will be a limit to what we tolerate from China. But we need to be conscious of the fact that this is a country that feels that they have been humiliated for a century, and they are flexing their muscles in the same way we flexed our muscles with the Monroe Doctrine back in the early 1800s. And even if we don't like it, come to realize that there's these huge areas where we have mutual interest, trade being number one, things like dealing with AI. I always say, you know who's more scared of AI than we are? The Chinese, because you can't control it, you can't audit it. So let's find these areas of common interest. Maybe it's climate change, by the way, very out of fashion these days, but I could name 4 or 5 areas where we, working with the Chinese and establishing partnerships there, could make real progress on some critical issues of interest to both of us. And I think that would take the temperature down.
Do you think the Biden administration got that balance right?
You're asking a question that tortures me a little bit. I think the world looked at the Biden administration and just said they're not really going to do anything. Whatever it was, they were obviously chastened by the visuals of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Joe Biden was never willing to do what Donald Trump did. And if I may quote, make a cultural reference here, put BB in a corner, right? Biden wasn't willing to do that. And Trump did it. I mean, that visual of Trump like holding the phone while the prime minister is apologizing to the Qataris.
Very powerful, yeah.
And so I think, though I don't like the randomness of the Trump foreign policy, it is interesting to see the United States say, hey, this is our interest and accommodate it or else. There's a limit to that, of course. But, you asked me about the Biden administration. I'm angry with the somnolence of the Biden administration in 12 different, categories. And as much as I'm appalled by the Trump administration, man, they use the tools at their disposal and then some.
Yes, and I would echo some of that. Sticking to defense, it was frustrating for me to see many people in the Biden administration, especially in the Defense Department, NSC, make a lot of the right noises on defense, on strategy, on technology, innovation, acquisition reform, Ukraine. But then when it came to actually taking urgent action, it just wasn't there.
Exactly.
It took way too long.
Here's my example of examples. And I understand the consequences of getting this wrong. But if, when the Russians crossed the Ukrainian border and all of a sudden it went to hell and, the Russians were fleeing and, they were on their way out. In that moment, if Biden had said, you withdraw across the border, We're not going into Russia. We have no ambitions, but we will not stop until your last troop is across the border. And in that moment, given the F-16s, given the HIMARS, this crap that we dribbled out over a 2-year period to get us to where we are today, an appalling stalemate, if Biden had said, across the border, we have no interest of damaging Russia. In fact, we want to trade more with you. We have no interest in damaging you. But until your last Russian troop is back across the border, we will not stop the flow of arms into Ukraine. Maybe we wouldn't be where we are today.
Yeah, I agree overall. I think there's some things that Ukraine, it's more important for them over the long term. F-16s is a good example, but certainly getting HIMARS out there more quickly. Cluster munitions is a big one for me.
Yep.
There was lifting the authorities for long-range strike, certainly. Let's turn to the Middle East. As always, a complicated region. What do you make, starting with this, what do you make of the staying power and success of the deal that the president brokered between Hamas and the Israelis?
Yeah, well, having been pretty critical of the administration on a lot of issues, let me be clear that they deserve a lot of credit for forcing this deal. And again, I think in my own view, it happened because Trump put the prime minister in a corner and said, you're going to do this. And he made it very clear to Hamas that we would really up the heat on them if they didn't do it. So credit where credit is due. I am very concerned. And by the way, delighted that the hostages were returned and that we seem to be getting humanitarian aid, not in fast enough. But anyway, predictable stumbles. I am very concerned about the future here. I think that until Prime Minister Netanyahu gets rid of the extremists in his cabinet, and that may require him to cede power, we'll never be in a place where the Israeli government is where we want them in terms of the West Bank or in terms of Gaza, right? This idea that they're going to hunt down the last man with an AK-47 in Gaza is just madness in terms of what that really means. And until we see the Arabs get very serious about putting together a multinational force that has credibility and is well armed and supported by the Western powers, we're just talking, right? So I'm very happy with where we are, but I don't see a lot of the things that I think need to happen to make this more permanent happening yet.
Yeah, I think the release of the hostages is obviously enormously important. Having said that, I wonder how much of this, I think the pressure from the president was certainly important. But I also wonder how much of this was the Israelis considering, hey, we actually can't defeat Hamas like we said we were going to. And we're stuck in this perpetual cycle of maneuver, strikes, clearing different parts of the strip, sort of pressing the balloon. And Hamas thinking, we've been under this enormous pressure. The hostages aren't actually getting us anything. And the only way for us to reconstitute is the ceasefire where we can, and then they have, start moving their people back into parts of Gaza and start governing and in their repressive fashion again. And so I wonder if it was just both sides also realizing that their efforts had sort of culminated and this was the only. So what I worry is we might just end up at a pre-October 7th phase again. Obviously with Hamas degraded, Gaza in ruins, enormous human suffering, but nothing actually solved politically. But we'll see what happens next.
I think I would agree with you. I think the prime minister saw a way to get the hostages home. And if you've been to Israel, last time I was there, it was February this year, the continued holding of the hostages was just breaking Israel. There were protests every night and at least every week. And so the prime minister saw an opportunity to get the hostages back. I think in the back of his mind, knowing him a little bit, he thought, well, I'll get those hostages back and then I'll have to manage Donald Trump, but then I'll have a free hand to do what I want. He's enough of a military man to know that he's not going to wipe out every last 18-year-old with an AK-47. He also understands that when this war is over, there's some serious accountability that will be visited to him and to his government. But to your point about can he militarily do it, look, one of the true things of the last 3 years has been the Israelis have done a whole bunch of stuff that none of us would have said would have been successful. The beeper operation against Hezbollah in Lebanon, the bringing of the entire nation of Iran to their knees through the destruction of their air defenses and stuff. The Israelis have, I think, shocked many of us with their ability to do some things that we thought were either not doable or only doable over a period of many, many years. Part
of it is will. I think, the pager operation is one example. I don't think they're the first country that thought of doing something like that. I think they were the first country willing to do something like that and with the technical know-how. And we'll see how much this opens up Pandora's box in the future. The Iran attack is interesting. Obviously, it required in the end our own military involvement. Do you think that was wise for us to get involved militarily?
If you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have said that's a crazy idea because Iran will mobilize their terrorist cells around the world, that they will retaliate. And you know what? That would have been wrong. They've been brought to their knees and they're cowed, right? We don't see Iranian-driven terrorist activity by and large around the world. We don't see Iraqi militias controlled by Iran attacking the U.S. embassy, et cetera. So I would have been wrong. Looking back on it now, here's what I think. It's going to go one of two ways. Well, that's a little bit absolute. Two big ways it could go. Number one, they draw the lesson that you can't negotiate with the West, that the Israelis, right in the middle of a negotiation, as happened, the Israelis will attack you. And so they're going to make a sprint for a device. And they'll do this sort of Pakistani thing. Like, sorry, guys, we're there. Live with it. That's a very real possibility. There's no doubt in my mind that there are members of the Iranian regime who have decided that that's what they need to do. They need to break out to a nuclear weapon because they've tried everything else. Not in good faith, but they've tried anything. The other route, of course, is that you have this country in all kinds of economic trouble. And maybe the regime falls. Maybe the regime decides to take a different turn. It's almost funny to say that because being optimistic about the evolution of the Iranian regime has never been a winning bet, but they've never been quite on their heels the way they are right now.
Yeah, I think one of the most fascinating stories of the century is how October 7th set into motion this chain of events that led to the defeat of Hezbollah. Relatedly, what happened at the same time, the collapse of the Assad regime. And so when you're looking at the Levant, it left Iran toothless, and the Iraqi militias, I think, were either told or probably thought it was smart to stay on the sidelines so far, at least. So none of the worst predictions. We published a great article by a scholar about what would happen if we attacked Iran. The elite coalescing, the population rallying around the flag, the activating of terrorist cells, the closing of the Hormuz Straits. None of that happened, which isn't to say it wouldn't happen if we attacked them again in the future, which I think we might, but it is an interesting story.
Yeah. No, and it's interesting. I don't really believe that terrorist forces around the world are subject to rigorous, cost-benefit thinking. But, if you're the Shabab in Somalia or some random Al-Qaeda-like group in, Algeria or whatever, you must be sort of scratching your head and saying, hey, turns out this model, even when you have the backing of the Iranians, right, one of the most powerful regional groups, and even when you have the backing of the
Hezbollah was the varsity team. Right?
They were the varsity team, and they got crushed. You must, again, the Shabab and all these groups are running their, criminal economic enterprises and stuff, so it's not like I think they're going to go away, but you'd think they'd be scratching their heads and saying, hey, does this model of change really work? Because you piss off the Western powers enough and you wind up like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so I don't know, maybe I'm allowing myself to be overly optimistic about what the lessons might be learned.
Well, speaking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS, what's interesting is we don't really talk about them that much anymore. Do you think we've taken our eye off the ball when it comes to jihadist terrorist groups? Or do you think that these groups are just strategically degraded and don't deserve as much attention anymore? I know it's probably somewhere in between the two, right?
I guess we've learned two things. Number one, through and you were part of this, through an immense amount of, time, talent, and treasure.
A very insignificant part of this, yes.
we can keep these groups back on their heels. It's enormously expensive, both in terms of lives and dollars and everything, but we can keep them on their heels. And the other thing that we've learned is that we can't end it. We can't end it through military means. I mean, on 9/11, there was Al-Qaeda and maybe one or two other groups running around Northern Africa. Now you've had this, fragmentation and explosion of all kinds of different groups. So on the one hand, we're pretty good at keeping it in a box. On the other hand, there's arguably more people involved in terrorism around the world today than there were on 9/11, 2001. And I think we better grapple seriously with that and ask ourselves, how do you... it's a little bit like the drug problem. An awful lot of fun, again, I keep saying for testosterone-laden people to see boats blow up. But the way you're going to end this, you'll never end drug addiction, but the way you're going to really do it is the profoundly boring and unsexy work of managing demand. In the same way that if you really if you don't want Somalia to be producing lots of Al-Shabaab, help Somalia actually offer some economic opportunity to its 18-year-old boys,
Not a topic we can do justice in just a few minutes, but I think you did a pretty good job there. Just in closing, what do you enjoy reading? when you're not legislating, and I know there's not a lot of legislating going on right now given the shutdown, but although I'm sure you're keeping busy.
Yeah. So I've fallen in its defensive. If I'm not reading a couple of good books, what I end up doing is doom scrolling before I go to bed, and that is a terrible way to live your life. And so I've always got a work of fiction and a work of nonfiction going. My nonfiction work usually tends to be national security oriented. There's a fellow, I'll get his name wrong, Anthony Vinci, who wrote a book called The Next Intelligence Revolution. I'm in the middle of that book right now. And I've got Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men going, the classic Southern novel of a demagogic leader, populist and stuff. So I've got those two cooking right now.
That's great. Well, thanks for making the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Do not forget to check out our membership program at warontherocks.com/membership. We also have a terrific podcast that's also free called Cogs of War, focused on defense technology and industrial issues. I think you'd enjoy that too if you enjoy War on the Rocks, so subscribe to it on your podcast app of choice. Stay safe and stay healthy.